What's up, you beautiful souls? Welcome to this edition of the Deeper Truth Healing Hour with me, Reverend LC. Now, often we're taught, whether it's through direct instruction or the subtle waves of societal blueprints, that success equals finding something that you're really good at and doing it so well that the world recognizes you for it. Then you become rich and famous and ultimately happy, right? Now imagine that you've spent years following this plan, and at the height of its accomplishments, it all falls apart. Well, that's what today's guest, Maroon 5 founding member and drummer Mr. Ryan Dusick, has experienced, and his story is truly remarkable. Ryan has written an amazing new book about his life, fame, disappointments, and ultimate healing called Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all, and finding recovery. I'm so grateful that he's here to share his deeper truth with us today. So I want you guys to join me in welcoming Mr. Ryan Dusick to the Deeper Truth Healing Hour. If y'all are ready, we're ready. So let's go. What's up, Ryan? Thank you so much for joining me here on the Deeper Truth Healing Hour and what will ultimately be season 5 of the Recovery Soul Food Podcast. Man, welcome, 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 welcome.
Thank you, Elsie. Great to see you again, and thank you for inviting me on.
Absolutely, man. You've written a book that is just so amazing to me. As we were talking about before we came on, I think the writing is just brilliant. The way that it holds a storyline is just remarkable. It takes you through the entire experience, and whether you're a musician or you've ever had big dreams, and it takes you through as if you're on this amazing ride. So bravo for that, and thanks for coming on and sharing about something that is so absolutely vulnerable. I can't imagine that this has been, an easy time for you in any way, since, addictions and recovery and depression and anxiety is never easy for anyone. But you've done a remarkable thing here in healing, in sharing it with the world on such a grand scale. So I'm really looking forward to hearing you share about, writing this book, Harder to Breathe, about your experience. And, like I told you before, I've got like 2 pages of places in your story that just I identified with so well, even to smallest details about your father and just different ways he was so outgoing and you were introverted. I mean, it's really an amazing book. So just you start where you want to start, man. Tell us who Ryan is, how Ryan got to be where he was, and how he found his deeper truth, discovered his deeper truth.
Well, first off, that's so great. I love how different people relate to different elements of the book. It's always so interesting to hear. Everything that's in the book is there for a reason. It's all relevant to my journey and everything that I've gone through and what I've learned. If I put it in there, I put it in there for good reason. But you never know what people are going to relate to. What's going to really kind of be the thing that somebody goes, oh yeah, I can see myself in that story. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. This book has been, I would say, a labor of love, but it hasn't really felt like labor. It was, I guess I would say, more like on a mission with the book. It's been very purposeful. It's been sort of the culmination of a lot of work that I was doing in my own life, in my own recovery, in my therapy, and then studying psychology. And so, this kind of just put everything together for me. It was the sort of the final stage of a long journey that I'd been on in my own healing, and the first stage of maybe, a new part of my life where I'm doing some interesting new things. So, I mean, to take you back, who am I? Where did I come from? How did this happen? I was the founding drummer of Maroon 5, and that was like, it almost feels like a whole other lifetime. I started that band when I was 16 with my brothers, and not literal brothers, my brothers in music, in my parents' garage. And over a decade, we went from the garage to the biggest stages in the world. And it was our dream. It was everything you described in the intro, in terms of just dreaming the biggest dreams you can imagine, and taking it as far as it can go. And it was very fulfilling along the road in terms of the creative process, in terms of the brotherhood and the connection that we felt with each other as human beings and as artists. And then we sort of reached the mountaintop, and all the things that I hadn't really dealt with in my individual self, all of physical injuries, as well as psychological mental health issues that I hadn't even really acknowledged, kind of all came together at that moment of external pressure, and coinciding with the internal pressure that I was putting on myself, to lead to this breakdown that was devastating, and led to me having to lead the band in 2006, just as we had this massive hit album and were becoming global stars. And that sent me into a tailspin. I just really went into a depression, and really what I see now is as a grieving process, losing my identity, losing that career, losing my connection to something that was spiritually really connecting and uplifting on a lot of levels. And so I had to really go to some really dark, deep depths to hit a bottom, which I did, the way that every alcoholic does at some point, sooner or later, if you go long enough. Some people are lucky enough to get out before they hit a bottom. But for me, it was something I had to go through. I thought I had it under control. I thought I was dealing with the anxiety and the depression the best way I knew how, coping with the alcohol and whatever else, until I didn't have it under control, and it became, I was just really kind of broken in a lot of ways, which led to this moment of clarity, which started this new journey in the last 6.5 years, starting with just getting clean, leading into being a volunteer and being of service, and then going back to school and studying psychology and becoming a mental health professional, and writing this book, which is now, like I said, kind of my new mission, to tell my story in a way that can be helpful for people. If they can see themselves in my journey, hopefully they can see the hope in my recovery.
Yeah.
And just kind of get out there and do my thing, helping people one person at a time, or hopefully, a lot of people at a time.
That's the beauty of it. I think that there's always been this deeper mission and message within, and I think that it'll turn out, and it probably already has in your deeper knowing, that one thing always leads to another. Maybe becoming this amazing rock star and achieving all of these dreams is what's going to now make this other mission of helping the world recover so much more passionate, so much bigger, because our world, our society right now, I mean, on a global scale, we don't even have to just talk about our country in general, but on a global scale, people are hurting. And I often believe that some of us that have gone through the depths of despair, the breakdowns, the even addictions, we're in a blessed position, because we are forced to look inwardly. We are forced to go to a place of true healing. And I believe that the world is in this space where they are longing for this and not sure how to really do this. And I think that with your story and who you've been, it shatters a lot of old paradigms that often we look at people that were in your position in Maroon 5 and think, who's this guy? What problems does he have? Well, that's a bullshit way to look at things, because I can only fathom the pressure that comes with now creating this masterpiece of this band, of this music that the world loves, and now you got to follow that up. And I can only imagine, and because I've read some of your story, your book, that there was a connection to feeling really good at something, to having that brotherhood, that creativeness. And I think that creativeness is our divine gift, from our creator, regardless of what the name of that is. It's this divine gift, and it often walks along this very thin line of creation and or complete destruction. And I think someone who is gifted to be highly creative will always teeter on that line. And the gift that you are, and what your story is going to now do in this world of necessary healing, is you've gotten vulnerable, which is a trend that is catching on somewhat, that is necessary to catch on more. And because of the accomplishments that you have accomplished and how you've talked about it, you know, it's going to change a lot of paradigms. It's going to open the door for a lot of people, and let's just say a lot of men, to be able to be more open to healing. A lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. If nothing else, what I wanted to achieve with this book was to be as honest and vulnerable as possible. I figured, just in terms of storytelling, people are going to relate to the story so much more if they feel that you're being genuinely honest and vulnerable in the way that you're expressing what you went through. I mean, for me, it was like, why bother telling a story if I'm just telling the facts? I have to really go back to those places and really talk about what it really felt like to go through it, because that's the only way that somebody's going to really see themselves in my story. So for that reason alone, I think that was my number one goal in writing it. But also, where I'm at in my life now, as much as I'm trying to, share the things I've learned, to be a model of what you just described. I think we need role models in terms of male vulnerability, vulnerability in general, but certainly with men, because historically, we're not comfortable with vulnerability. We're told to tough it out and to be a man. And that can lead to more problems. You can be a strong person and get through some tough stuff just like with a stiff upper lip. But a lot of times when you're pushing down those vulnerable feelings and masking them with whatever it may be, anger, aggression, self-anger, there's so many ways in which we cope with those vulnerable feelings that feels more powerful, but we're just avoiding what is actually going on underneath the surface. And so, hopefully, in providing a model of what it is to be vulnerable, we sort of give people the permission to feel that themselves and to actually do the work that's required to work through the things that are challenging for us, rather than just kind of pushing them aside.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that was reading the part where you actually, and I thought some of the most honest sharing came in when you were describing that talk with the band, when it was this moment where the band is saying, okay, we can't take you with us, and the ways that you vulnerably shared about all the emotions you went through at that time. I mean, from the defensiveness to the anger to even almost the begging to, wait a minute, let me still be a part of this, and to then go back to, and I couldn't really see that at that time, so I just held on to my anger. I think it was brilliantly described. And in reading the stories, you almost see it go back to the initial, the sports time, that identity of being that sports star, and then all of a sudden that's gone. And it almost, if the body keeps the score, then was the body keeping the score this time in the next, pinnacle of success that you had to perform? Did the body keep the score then and start stepping in the way? And we don't, as a collective, truly understand how much trauma is stored in the body, how environmental triggers work, and how our mind works in a very subconscious way to try to avoid that pain by almost creating that pain. I mean, what would you say to that, for you and in general?
Wow, you could have written this book. You say it so clearly. Exactly what it is that I'm trying to get across. And I put that story about me and and baseball, my first passion, my first love as a kid.
Yeah.
In that chapter about my childhood, I put that in there for that reason, because it does parallel what happens later in my career as a musician. And I think that our bodies speak to us. They tell us
Hmm.
what's going on with us, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't listen, right? And the body gets louder and louder, and it's telling you you need to slow down, or you're terrified, you need to deal with your anxiety.
Mm.
Whatever it is that we really need to deal with, our body will speak louder and louder until we get the point. And that happened with me with baseball. I mean, to this day, I don't know, how much of what happened with pitching and with drumming was physical and how much of it was psychological. It was a combination of both. But really, baseball was something that I loved so much, and it's the place where I felt powerful and I felt like I was really in my element, and something I was really motivated and passionate about doing. But it became harder and harder as I had some injuries, and as I was trying to work through the pressure I was putting on myself, the perfectionism that I felt, the obsessive compulsiveness that I was, just the ways in which I was straining and putting stress on myself internally started to meet up with external pressures, which was creating a situation where I was breaking down.
Mm.
And my body just started getting out of whack. Like I couldn't throw the ball the way that I used to. And every time I would try to come back from injury, just trying to be tough, as the way that my teammates and my coach would tell me, you got to toughen
Yeah.
up. I would try to push through it, and things would just keep getting worse and worse until it wasn't fun anymore, until I didn't have that passion anymore. And I just felt like I wanted to walk away from something that used to be my greatest joy.
Yeah.
And I did. And thankfully, at that point in my life, I found music, and music was my new passion. And I just kind of like made a total, right turn into a whole other world, which was incredibly gratifying, in that this was the early to mid 90s, when it was the era of grunge rock and a lot of
Great
very
time.
sort of, right. But really dark and heavy stuff that
Yeah.
really spoke to me, the stuff that I was going through as a teenager, and dealing with sort of disillusionment and feeling, just wondering who I was and trying to figure out what my identity in the world was.
Yeah.
And so pounding on the drums and finding that new identity, expressing myself in that way, it felt like freedom, and it felt like a new passion. And that became my new sort of coping mechanism for the things that I hadn't really dealt with inside, right?
Yeah.
And so you fast forward to the years, a decade later, when I was on the road day after day, week after week, month after month, and it became too much between those internal issues and now the external pressure again. And the same thing really happened again. I started to break down. My body started telling me, you can't do this anymore. You're killing yourself, basically. And I didn't listen. I just I got to push through it. There's no taking a break here. There's no taking care of yourself. We have a mission to do, and we're we got to get out there and take over the world with our music. And my body just kept getting louder and louder, to the point where it's like, you cannot play the drums anymore. And the body keeps a score. If you aren't listening, it will just keep speaking louder.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. And it'll take you to depths, to the point where, a lot of people don't come back. And I think that, part of the beauty of us sitting here and having this conversation, and you said something when we first started this broadcast, is that, we go to these bottoms, but the mission, I know in my heart, and I believe it's in your heart as well, is that maybe if we get out in front and start vulnerably sharing about these things on whatever scale it is, that people will realize that you really don't have to take it, because the old paradigm of addiction and recovery was you have to get to your rock bottom. Well, I don't
Mm.
necessarily believe that's so. I believe that we can begin to talk about this and healing, because it's all a conglomerate, right? Like, when we talk about addiction, you got to talk about mental health, because if you don't, you're leaving out the root core of a lot of the issues. And so, when we're talking about all of it, the hope that I have for sharing about a lot of my life so openly is that maybe you can see something that can keep you from going all the way to that rock bottom, because in today's climate you may or may not come back. I mean, it's kind of, the 90s were a magical and very dark time, and they did. That music at that time really gave us this ability to hear someone speaking about the darkness that we felt, while also in this with very beautiful melodies and things that felt almost divine in creation. I was a musician myself, and just being able to get lost in those rhythms, in those, beats, in those lyrics, were a time that I don't know that necessarily music has spoken to me since. And I don't know if it's just because I remember the depth of that time, but I see it as a beautifully dark time in history. And you know, one of the things that I hear in reading your book and listening to you speak that resonates so deeply with me is just the word identity, and how building these external identities, which is, again, like the opening said, what we're taught either through instruction directly, or subtle societal, that you have to build these external identities. And I've done that so many times. We even build an identity in being an addict. There's all these external identities that keep getting us further and further away from our true identity, which is the divine expressions of God and creation. That's how I feel about it. But I mean, I've been through them all, and being a transgendered human being in the world right now, you know I even did it then, and I see it happening in our climate, in our society, is these external identities are breaking away, and we're trying to hold on to them with all of our might, through political, through financial, through LGBTQ plus communities. We're all building these external identities, and there is a healing in just letting go of those and falling into your deeper truth and who you are. And I know one thing about your story is that very initial, the baseball and the sports really brought you and your dad closer, which seemed to be, there was kind of a gap there between you and your father. Would you say that possibly that was born in that maybe we had now this bond, that maybe you didn't feel so much? And how did that change, or was it ever an issue after the baseball fell apart?
Well, I think that a lot of people can relate. A lot of boys can certainly relate to the idea that, growing up, the one thing you have that's a connection with your father is sports.
Mm,
You know, I think that's probably because there are a lot of men who are fathers who aren't comfortable with their emotions. And the one way that they can connect with their child is to talk about, batting averages and ERAs and all that
that's
stuff.
good.
And there's a lot of lessons. I mean, I look at baseball as sort of a metaphor for life in a lot of ways. And
Absolutely.
it's a wonderful metaphor, and that's why it's my favorite sport. But I think that for my dad is a lovely guy who actually is relatively well in touch with his emotions and his feminine side, compared to a lot of men that I know. But for whatever reason, that was our biggest bond, and it didn't happen right away. When I was a little kid, sports wasn't really yet my thing until I
Hmm.
started to get really good at baseball towards like the end of Little League when I was 10 to 12. Um, and during that time, fortunately enough, the Los Angeles Dodgers, who are my favorite team, I grew up in LA. It was also a golden era for the Dodgers. I mean, 1988 was the championship year, the Cinderella season. And so we had that moment together, Kirk Gibson hitting this home run and Oral Hershiser, my favorite pitcher, just having the greatest season of all time on the mound. And so that really bonded me and my dad, just watching
That's
those
awesome.
moments together. I just remember us, hugging each other and just jumping up and down when the Dodgers won the World Series. And so, more so than anything else that I can imagine, that was something that bonded us. I was actually more
That's
of kind of a
great.
mama's boy up
Right.
until that point. My mom and I were very close. I was kind of, uh, I was very affectionate with her. She put a lot of her energy and love into me, and I was a very shy kid. I was like holding on to her leg all the time even when we go into like family events and things. But baseball was kind of the one place that I emulated my dad more, who was much more of a sort of outgoing, big personality. He seemed very sure of himself in most contexts, and I think that I emulated that when I was on the mound in terms of being just more confident and being at least stepping into an identity, as you put it. That was one of the first identities that I owned in terms of, I know who I am when I'm on the mound. I'm this person who has supreme confidence that I can dominate and I can put the ball exactly where I want it and I can strike anyone out. And that identity was really comfortable and powerful for me. And so, of course, it was really painful when that identity started slipping away. And I had to kind of grapple with, who am I if I'm not that guy who feels that confidence on the mound? And then entering into this phase of adolescence that's so awkward and there's no confidence anymore. It's, who the heck am I? And then, so in a lot of ways, I kind of feel like when I look back, I've lived like 4 lifetimes already, because there's been like 4 different identities. There was that childhood baseball identity. And then there was this music guy for a decade that I was the drummer in this band. I was 1/4 and then 1/5 of this artistic creative entity. And that was like my whole self-definition of who I was. And when that was gone, I didn't know who the hell I was. I mean, I was an alcoholic, as you said. That was my new identity. It was just, I was a guy with a lot of free time. I felt really bad, complaining about my lot in life, because I had been so fortunate in so many ways, which you alluded to earlier. It's like, I dealt with that a lot. Who the heck am I to complain, having had the success that I've had and getting to do the things that I've gotten to do in my life. I can't call anything that's happened to me trauma, because it's all been a blessing. I just wasn't good enough to hack it. I just wasn't good enough to stay there. So I would just keep kind of pounding on myself and beating myself down with that self-loathing, rather than admitting I went through something really difficult. It doesn't matter that I had success and then I had all these things.
Right.
Trauma is relative to the individual. And I had to deal with that loss. I had to deal with how painful that was, and the loss of that identity, and eventually find a new one, and finding a new identity and purpose and something that's fulfilling and that gives me meaning in my life. That has been ultimately the closure and the element of acceptance that I needed to move past that grieving process and find a new chapter in my life, which is like, the 4th life that I've lived so far.
And it's so, and I think that the differentness and the sameness in what you're saying right now, because as being in that place of active addiction, there is so much self-loathing, and regardless of whether you've stood on stages in front of tens of thousands, or if you've if you're just right there with yourself, there's so much of that shame. And I can imagine that even in that situation, that that shame would grow even more. Because I mean, I can only imagine that you would think, well, who do I call with this? Or I don't deserve to complain. And again, that just isolates, which is what the disease of addiction does. It isolates. So you're in your own head, which is a dangerous place to be, with those same thoughts, that just loop over and over and over again. I often think, when I listen to meditations on, say, YouTube or something, that loop for 8 hours, I think about how many years of my life I just spent in a meditative loop of how terrible I was, and how much all my failure was my fault, and how I should have done this and should have done that. And we get in those loops that are relentless, that you're almost drowning, and you have to grab something somewhere to start pulling yourself out. And if you don't mind, I'd love for you to go into maybe the depths of that addictive and looping period, and what was there that started helping you begin to see the light of hope?
Well, looking back at that time in my life, I really did feel that there was no other human being on this planet that would understand what I had gone through and what I was going through. And it's not that I didn't think that anyone on the planet had ever experienced anxiety or depression or loss or alcoholism or perfectionism or obsessive compulsiveness or any of the things that I was going through. I just felt that my situation was so terribly unique, terminal uniqueness,
Yeah. Yeah.
that there was just no way that anyone would ever be able to understand, uh, and that it was so profound that my life could never be the same again. That essentially the place I was at when I was trying to move on with my life, rather than trying to find new purpose, was basically I have to accept the fact that what happened to me is not going to change, and that my life is essentially going to suck from now on. And so I'm just going to find ways to make it as tolerable as I can for whatever remainder of this sort of miserable life that I'm going to be living. And then the self-loathing of was it was twofold. One, beating myself up for the ways in which I felt like I was a failure, that I couldn't hack it, that I wasn't good enough, that there was something defective in me. And then it was, but here I am in this place of incredible good fortune. I had this hit album. I made a bunch of money. I'm in a situation where I don't have to go get a day job anytime soon. I have free time to do whatever it is that I want, to pursue anything in my life that I want. And I'm miserable. And nothing brings me pleasure. Nothing is enjoyable. All the things that used to be passions for me are just not enjoyable anymore. I used to feel that I had to get a certain amount of alcohol in me even to just listen to music, let alone enjoy it or play it or create it, because it was tied up in my trauma. Music was the thing that brought me so much joy, and now it was a reminder of everything that had been so painful and I had lost. And so there was just that double whammy of feeling defective and feeling like I should be able to have pleasure and enjoyment in my life, and I don't. And so I adopted this sort of nihilistic attitude. That it was very conscious. It was almost like, this is the only way through this, is nothing matters at all, because the things that mattered to me so much are gone. So why really care about anything? It really completely disillusioned me in a way that my teenage years had kind of been an introduction to it. That was the first time in my life that I felt that sort of existential angst.
Yeah.
Where I was like, oh my God, what does it all mean? Which we all go through at some point in our life, one way or another, whether it's through a loss or just coming of age or realizing that our identity was not what we thought it was.
Yeah.
But, as a teenager, it was a very, I think, common thing that I went through maybe it's a boy thing. Maybe I don't know if it's gendered or if it's just something we all go through in different ways. But as a teenage boy, I was like that stereotype of a brooding young man who was just kind of like, I don't know, angsty, I guess, for lack of a better term. But that was just an introduction. And then I had this real reason why I felt a real void in my life. And it all came crashing in again. This existential void that the only way I knew how to fill it up was just with distraction and escape and avoidance. And that took the form of this sort of alter ego that I stepped into, where nothing matters at all. Whatever pursuit of pleasure that can give me a moment of joy was the only thing that was worth doing. And so whether it was getting a certain amount of drinks in me, it was going out with a pretty girl and, having a night on the town and not thinking about my worries, whatever it was that just, got me out of self in that way, out of my head, was what I was pursuing. And of course, that just meant everything I wasn't dealing with was just festering more and more. And I would be left at the end of one of those nights crying and shaking in the fetal position, wondering, how did I go from laughing and partying a few hours ago to having a panic attack and crying myself to sleep? How did that happen? And so it was just this cycle of just having no self-awareness, really, just like thinking, what, not me being able to make the connection between the ways in which I was trying to cope and how it was actually making things worse and worse day after day, until I did reach this. I'm really fortunate. We talked about the reaching a bottom earlier, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that you don't need to reach the kind of bottom that some people reach in order to get it.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the reason why a lot of people do need to reach that bottom to get it is because we have so many mechanisms of denial and
Yeah.
rationalization in our
Yeah.
mind and in our culture too. You know,
Oh
our
yeah.
culture gives us reasons to rationalize our drinking and using, and ways in which it's actually more normal to be in that pattern than to be somebody in recovery and to have
Yeah.
to say, I'm an addict, or I'm somebody who, cannot handle my drink. So for me, I see myself as having reached a bottom, just in the sense of a spiritual bottom,
Mhm.
feeling
Yeah.
broken and feeling disconnected from life, not feeling any real purpose or connection to something larger than myself, just on a daily basis being wholly fixated on my own suffering and the ways in which I was trying to cope with it on a minute to minute basis.
Mm.
And so, very fortunate that it wasn't the kind of bottom you hear about, sitting in a jail cell, having gotten a bunch of DUIs and dealing with, legal repercussions for it, or having injured someone or myself, or having,
Yeah.
uh, things that are irreversible in terms of the damage that this kind of disease can cause.
Yep.
So for not having reached that kind of bottom, I am eternally grateful. And that was a very motivating factor for me in early recovery, was recognizing, oh my goodness, this could have been so much worse. From
Mm.
where I was at, if I kept going the way I was going, there's so much more damage I could have done to myself and to others. And so, for it to have just been a spiritual bottom, that was all that I needed, though. I mean, there was just that moment of clarity, which is so odd when you're wasted to have a moment of clarity.
Right.
But it was enough. There was enough that was humbling. There was enough that was painful. There was enough that was just, I couldn't ignore anymore, that I was doing this to myself at that point. It didn't matter what caused this. It didn't matter how I ended up with this disease. All that mattered was that I was contributing to maintaining it and making it worse at that point. And that I just needed to try to figure out a way to get out of my own way.
Mm.
Rather than leaning into the denial and the devastation that I was causing myself, just try to pick my head up, turn around, and start walking in the other direction. As terrifying as that was, because I had to be stripped of the coping mechanisms that had become so familiar, and embrace something that was entirely foreign and new and required change, which is always scary. But I found very early on, when I started walking in that direction and I started just accepting the help that was being offered to me, and reaching that place of humility, that obviously my way of doing things was not working and I needed to try somebody else's way, and just be open to that change and growth. That's when things really started to change for me, and it really was a spiritual awakening very early on. And I had to grapple with what spirituality was for me, because I wasn't a religious person.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been raised Jewish, but never very, we weren't exactly uh, religious about it. I mean, we went to temple on the holidays and stuff like that, but it wasn't something that was a big part of my life in terms of my definition of spirituality. So that was something I had to grapple with early on. But it became very clear to me what spirituality was once I felt connection in my life again.
Mm.
And it just was, going to meetings and being with people that were going through the same thing as me. I realized I was not alone. Everything I felt alone with was an illusion, and that I was connected to other people in ways that I had just been blind to, because it was buried underneath the addiction. And so feeling that connection, that was the thing that I really I grabbed onto with both hands, and realized, if this feels this good, if feeling connected in this way feels motivating in this way, then all I have to do is continue to search for that feeling, whatever provides that feeling, and it will lead me in the right direction. And that's all I
Mm.
did. And it was really just one thing after another that took me from that to where I am now.
Well, that's amazing, and again, it to me it makes you sharing your story at this time again even more valuable, because we do hear a lot of the rock bottom stories that end in a lot of irreversible damage. You know, we've and for those of us that have been to those places of that irreversible damage, there were places that you're talking about along the way. There were places along the journey that we could have, jumped off of the sinking ship, so to speak. And it's only through retrospect, that you look back and go, oh, that might have been a moment. I mean, even when I think about how I even learned about the band Maroon 5 was I had been the longest stretch I had ever done in lockup. Some girl came in and were singing these songs, and she had a great voice, and I could hear these songs and these melodies, and I was like, what are you singing? Who are you singing? And that was the way that I discovered this band called Maroon 5 while I was locked up. It would be a whole nother year before I ever actually heard the songs by the band. So all I'd ever heard of this Maroon 5 was through this one person singing. And you know, again, it was in that time of that lockup period that I started having those moments of clarity, so to speak, those sparks of hope that you know I gotta get off of this train. Like I gotta figure out something to do. And though it would not be the last time that I ever visited it, I learned a lot in that time. And what you're talking about in, that spiritual part, all it really is connection. That spiritual part shows us what we need the most of, and that is to be connected to other human beings in a way that is much deeper than we have the same job, than we have the same disease. It is a connection of heart to heart, and then from there grows this connection to a passion. One of the things that I all would like to ask you is what during that time, your healing time, how did it really start? So we've talked about you started going to meetings. What else were you doing along with that to make this a whole program for you?
Well, I actually started out my journey of recovery in rehab. I went out to the Betty Ford Center here in Southern California in the desert, and I needed, to go into a detox. My drinking had become bad enough that I needed a detox, and then I was inpatient, at the center there for a month, um, and I was being weaned off of some of the medication I was on, and that first month, of course, was really challenging.
Yeah.
but it was also, it's funny how, because I remember, of course, being extremely anxious and having to deal with a lot of things all at once, and that were terrifying. But also looking back, it's like one of the best times of my life in some ways too. It's like I often feel like I wish I could do that again, because how many times in your life do you feel like you're just like waking up to the world and
Yeah.
finding connections and finding inspiration? It was like, learning to walk again, and just having all the world open up to me and all the possibilities
Mm.
that were presented. And after I left the Betty Ford Center, I did a couple months. I did one inpatient and one in their sort of graduate program. I guess I was like in a sober living house and going to their classes. And they recommended I go to an outpatient program back home in LA. And I did that for a few months. And that was just kind of like maintaining the structure and continue. It was actually not a 12-step based place. It was a cognitive behavioral therapy based place. So it was a different take on it in terms of both the sort of neuroscience about it, the brain chemistry of addiction and recovery, but also just these very practical notions of how to deal with triggers and how to deal with thoughts of using and cravings and all this stuff. And so that was really helpful. And then I was 6 months in and leaving that program, and there was this, again, going to be a sort of void, because it was like my identity had been, I'm recovery man, and
Yeah.
I'm in these programs, and now it's like there's going to be a lot more hours in my week, and how am I going to fill that, and what is that going to look like? What's my new purpose going to be? And I did two things at that point. I started going a lot more AA meetings, and I got a sponsor, and I started working the steps again. And the other thing was that I started volunteering at that center that I had been going to as a graduate. I mean, here I was, I don't know, 6 to 9 months sober, and I was teaching people about recovery and, giving people just listening to them tell their stories, telling them my story, and relating the things I'd learned in my short time in recovery. And that alone was probably the most meaningful experience I had had in a decade, because I was being of service to another human being. I felt not only was it wonderful to be giving in that way, but also I was discovering talents that I either didn't know I had or had forgotten that I had because they'd been locked up underneath this addiction and everything I've been struggling with. And it was empowering. It was, you talked about pride earlier. Um, pride can be taken two ways. It could be either having an ego that's out of control and
Yeah,
being
right.
self-obsessed, or it could be taking pride in the things that you
Yeah.
do, that you feel a passion for, something that you feel purposeful in doing, and having that confidence again, feeling like I have something to offer and
Yes.
I'm getting good feedback when I do it. People respond well when I do it. It gave me purpose, and it gave me something to look forward to. And so I just wanted more and more of that. And I volunteered at this recovery center for 2 years. And I got enough good feedback that people were saying, like, you should be doing this for a living. You should be, a professional, a mental health professional. And I had never considered that before. But then I was like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And given what my sort of innate talents are and some of the skills that I learned in this process and from everything that I've gone through, I would have some really unique perspectives to offer my clients. And so it just became a no-brainer at that point. And I was like, the next indicated action for me is to go back to school and get a degree in clinical psychology and become some kind of counselor or therapist. And so I did that. And like I said, it was just like one thing after another. It was the next thing that indicated itself to me as, this is your path. This is the thing that's fulfilling to you. This is the thing that provides purpose and embraces your talents. And so it was just obvious to me. And in the course of doing that, I rediscovered another, passion that I'd had and forgotten about, which was writing. And I was writing a lot of papers in grad school, and having to do a lot of self-reflection papers.
Mm.
You have to do self-reflection to become a therapist, because if you haven't dealt with your own stuff, how are you going to
Right.
help someone else, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was like another level of therapy for me, to be applying the things that I was learning about psychology to myself and my journey and the therapist I was going to become. And then the next thing indicated itself. It's like, well, I have a story to tell. It's unique in some ways, but it's also very relatable in a lot of ways. And I have this platform, and I have a new mission. I need to tell my story in book form, in a way that people can relate to it, just as a story, a character in a story that people can relate to. And if they can relate to it in that way, then they can hopefully see, hope in my recovery for themselves. So that became the next thing. That was my mission and my purpose. And it was just following what I described, just like feeling that connection to something purposeful, feeling that spiritual awakening, and just grabbing onto it and following it wherever it takes me.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something to be said for that, that divine intuition to just keep, asking those questions. And I think that, the cognitive behavioral therapy was probably the most life-changing for me, having spent 22 years in an active hellish addiction, escape, coping through this the only way I knew how, with so much, that in all the times that I had made attempts to, because we think, oh, well, if I take the drugs and alcohol away, my life will just get better. And the beautiful thing about really, and I was learning cognitive behavior therapy on my own, on accident. You know what I mean? I was just looking for what we seek, we'll find. And as seekers, what just depends on where you put the seeking. And I knew I was desperate to know that, listen, I either got to die or figure this out, like one of the two, but we can't just keep drudging this life on. And it really doesn't matter what the bottom looks like. I think we all get to a place where we're like, something's got to give. And it was starting to learn the processes that are happening neurologically and chemically within the body that almost gave me permission that I wasn't just the total fuck up. That it wasn't just a lack of strength or willpower or want to do this, that there were other things happening as well. And it kind of almost gave me this partnership of like, okay, I'm a mind, I'm a body, and I'm a spirit. So I can't just take all of this on to me and carry the weight myself. And then, you talk about even going into service and 12-step places where you are surrounded by people that are also taking this journey, people that have more, experience than you, and people that have less. It's such a great balance. And, I admire that you have taken each one of those steps as they've presented themselves, because what you have really truly done with the book is everything that you set out to do, which is make things in there that are told in such a way that you can find yourself in there. I come from a very traumatic background, and yet, you know in some of the first pages of the book, I can see this beautiful correlation between your dad and my grandfather, and just the ways that feeling that embarrassment because of their big personality, because of me being such an introvert, I would shrink down when he talked to everyone in the elevator or make the dad jokes. And that was a moment in there where it's like I could almost feel close to this story. And so, what you've set out to do with this, I really feel like you've accomplished. And, that so many different places. When I talk to people often about, because I work with people and families that are going through gender transition, recovery, and families that their children are transitioning, and oftentimes we talk about how alike a lot of our journeys are. I identified truly with your loss of identity. I resonated so much with your feeling defective, in different times in your life, especially in that childhood place where you feel like, oh, something's wrong with me. What's wrong with me? And that, to me, just goes to show that regardless of what the details of our stories are, we are all truly of one creation, that we are all of one, and that we're more alike than we are different, and yet our differences should be honored and really celebrated, because that's how we were made. It blows my mind that we can't see that there are people on earth that can't see that this is a divine plan. So, I really, really look forward to, as the book continues to come out and gain, even more traction, and continue to reach more people, and as you continue to move in service, because what you're doing with us, with these things that we're doing, like right now, is being of service, helping that your voice reach different audiences, and I admire that, and I think we're going to see a lot of people helped. I think we're going to see a lot of people helped through all of this, and I admire you. You've got a lot of stuff coming up. You're going to South by Southwest, which is a really, really big deal. Do you look forward, or have you already made connections within the music, say acting, so I guess we can just call it what it is, like the celebrity community, that people have had the same experiences as you? Or, I mean, have you made many connections there, or is that still coming up?
I'm starting to, I'm in that moment right now where I'm kind of starting, basically three different careers at the same time. I've been seeing clients as a therapist for 2 years now, but I'm really just starting to build my own practice
Mhm.
and all that stuff. So I'm really, really in the early stages still of that career, but I have this book out, so I'm an author, and what's coming from it also is these opportunities to speak and
Yeah,
do things like this, but also in person, going and speaking to groups, doing conferences, doing things like this thing in South by Southwest, which is a panel about mental health in the touring industry. So it's very specific to something I have a lot of
it's
experience
amazing.
with. And so, these kind of opportunities are wonderful for me, but they're also great opportunities to speak to people that need to hear some of the experience that I've had. And I'm really just kind of exploring where that'll lead me. I did think at a certain point when I did go back to school and I was wondering what kind of a therapist am I going to be exactly. I had thought, I would just work at a recovery center. That was my first thought. And then, my sort of horizons were expanded in all the study that I did in the different fields and areas that I was studying and exploring. Excuse me. And I realized that I probably it would be I would be neglecting an important part of my past and what I
Mhm.
have to offer if I didn't seek out and sort of market myself to people that are in the same industries and are having the same experiences anywhere in the spectrum of what I did, whether it be success, failure, just starting out, dealing with the pressures, dealing with the anxieties, the perfectionism, performance anxiety, all the things that go along with whether it be being an actor, as you said, or an artist of some kind, a creator, a performer, a musician, an athlete. So I do think that there is an avenue there where I'm starting to find maybe there's a path for me, both as a therapist and as a speaker. But again, my horizons and my options are always expanding, and I'm looking for different ways in which I can just be of service and be purposeful in what I'm doing in terms of helping people. Humbly speaking, I think that I have some things that I've learned and gained in my journey that came from the struggle that it almost feels like it would be a shame to not use that and to not offer that in a helpful way. And so anyway, any form that takes, I'm happy to do it.
No, yeah, absolutely. I feel the same exact way. It's almost a shame, to come back from that and not share it because there's other people experiencing that. Is there any piece of advice, or not even piece of advice, or something you might share with any young musician, whether they have achieved, already some fame and fortune and feeling the pressure, or someone who's just starting out? Would there be anything that you could look back on retrospectively and share with someone coming up that maybe you learned through your journey?
I think when I look back at my journey and I look at some of the regrets that I've had, the things that I look and like, oh, why didn't I get that earlier? Why couldn't I have had that little piece of wisdom? It would have helped me so much on my journey. I think it was being a young man and being proud in the unflattering ways, being defensively all or nothing in my thinking. I'm either great or I'm not great. I'm either there and I'm perfect and I should be admired for everything I'm doing, or I'm a failure and I'm defective. And so with that came this defensiveness of not being very teachable,
Mm,
right? Not being able to bring in new information or accept any criticism as constructive, right?
yeah.
So, I mean, the advice that I would give my younger self and to somebody in that position now is, be teachable, be open to the idea that you don't have all the answers, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're not great. It doesn't
Right.
mean you're not
Mm,
absolutely amazing and doing something wonderful. I used to hate the word potential.
mm,
my
mm,
parents would say like, well, you have so much potential at this or that. And I would get frustrated. I would say, I don't want to have potential. I want to be great already.
yeah.
And it's like, nobody's born great. Even if you have talent, even if you have a lot of things that are going for you, you have to foster that talent, and you have to be teachable, and you have to be willing to work and to grow. And I wish I had understood that earlier in my life, because it would have saved me a lot of pain, and it would have led to some of the ways in which I've learned and grown much earlier in my life. So yeah, remain teachable. Even look, the greatest performers in the world, the greatest athletes, the greatest leaders can still learn new lessons. And it's the
Mm,
ones who are truly great and have a great career in whatever field they're in. The ones that take that mindset that I'm a forever a student.
mm.
It doesn't matter if I'm an expert for 40 years on something. There's more for me to learn. If you have that mindset, it's a mindset of growth, and you're going to move forward into the world in a much more graceful way.
That's outstanding. Man, I can't think of like I could probably sit here with you all day and pick this entire thing apart, but I think that's so perfect to leave with it, because it really doesn't matter who you are, or where you are, or what you're going, whether you're going to play on a stage in front of thousands or millions, or if you are going to start college tomorrow, or whatever you're doing. That's perfect advice for that, because you know if only we can always remain teachable. And I think that's one of the greatest assets of my entire life and my journey at this point, is that I feel like I'm always in a position to be taught. And I've learned so much, a lot, here today from you. I'm still learning from reading your book. I learned from every person that I connect with on a grand scale, just because It's I'm a student of humanity, a student of human beings, and I really appreciate you coming here today for writing this book, sharing your deeper truth, and on a global scale, for coming here and sharing it with us. I'm just grateful, just super grateful to have made this connection with you. Now, let's talk about where people can get in touch with you. Ryan says Instagram is the greatest place to touch base with him now. So that's at Instagram at Ryan underscore Michael underscore Dusick. And from there, they can click on your bio and get the book and everything, correct? Awesome.
Yeah, the book Harder to Breathe is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere you buy books. And I have a website as well, ryandusick.com, that you can check out. But Instagram, I put a lot of fun old videos of the band from our formative years and stuff, and photos, and I'll post whatever I'm working on in terms of appearances and stuff like that. So it's a good catch-all as well.
Yeah, I've
Perfect.
absolutely I've loved watching some of those older videos that you put out on Instagram. Those are so neat to just watch, and I think that it goes right along with the advice you just gave. I mean, if you go and watch those videos on Instagram and see the band, and I have everything to believe that even as great as the band is still today, you had a big part in that. Like, I don't think they could be this great without having have been all in all of those journeys. Now, you're still in contact with those guys, and because Adam Levine has written the foreword to your book, I mean, it seems like they're very supportive for you in this great new chapter. How does that make you feel? I mean, to have your brothers in your life and have them support you.
Yeah, that's great. Adam and I will be brothers for life. We really we grew up together. I was in that band from age 16 to age 28. He's a couple
Wow.
years younger than me, so he was 14 to 26. And so very formative years. We really do feel like brothers. And time will pass that we don't see each other or talk, for some time. But then there will be moments when we are just up late at night texting each other and being silly like we're teenagers still. So having that connection is lovely, and I'm happy for him and all of his successes, and that the band continues to do wonderful things, and I'm proud of them. I do feel connected to it in some ways. In other ways, it feels like like I said, another lifetime. But yeah, Adam wrote the foreword. I'm very grateful for that, and they've been all great. They contributed quotes to the back cover, the other guys in the band, and so it's wonderful. I'm happy that they're supportive of me. I really appreciate that, and I wish them the best.
That's absolutely amazing. Well, man, I wish you the best in every single thing that you do. I look forward to this being on the bestsellers, in the category of all categories. I look for this to be And I look for you to be everywhere with this. And I appreciate your sharing such vulnerability here and writing this book. I look forward to finishing it. Y'all make sure that you go and follow Ryan Dusick on Instagram. Go to ryandusick.com. Everything will be in the description of this video as well. This has been an amazing Deeper Truth Healing Hour, and I'm so grateful for all of you. And thank you for tuning in and helping support me to live my dreams. Now let me help to support you and live your dreams. You are amazing. And remember this: you can, no matter where you are, you can get up from your give up and you can create a life you love. All right, y'all. Until next time, I love you so much. Have an amazing week. This is Reverend LC, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.